Cora Auntie. Love this poem by Paula Meehan. Meehan is a tremendously interesting poet who writes complex and nuanced poems which reward repeated reading. I know I say that a lot about poets' work, but the work of poets, but I certainly do believe that to be true. And most of the cases, I make that comment, and certainly true with Paula Meehan. This is a very deeply personal poem, so I'm going to go through it quickly as possible. Deeply personal poem. There are sequins, and as you know, sequins are shiny, and essentially each one of them is of no real value at all. And one of the most interesting things about Paula Meehan's poetry is how she looks at things that appear to be of little value, and points out that actually, do you know what, they're quite valuable. A field in Finglas, um, a community abandoned by society to a drug epidemic. Um, her mother, a woman living in poverty, who's so poor that when her husband gives her a pittance of money to try to survive, she just feels, completely despair and throws it on a fire. And a child looking at the mother and feeling awe for her bravery and her strength and her majesty. So one of the things that Paula Meehan does is she looks at things that appear to be of little value, and she shines a light on their value, which is thought provoking, and just on a philosophical level. Never mind the leaving cert, something that I think we all need a bit of reminder of. And in this case, it's her auntie, Cora, her mum's sister, and this poem has three sections. In the opening section, we get this narrative. Don't forget, Paula Meehan often adopts a narrative style, much like Elizabeth Bishop and Derek Meehan, who are on your course. And we get this, lovely pen portrait, little, description of Cora as an older woman. And it begins with this really striking and unusual opening sequence. Staring death down with a bottle of morphine in one hand and a bottle of Jameson in the other, laughing at death, love unconditional, keeping her just this side of the threshold. Fantastic opening sequence. It's like you can really get a sense of the character of Cora, a tough woman, like obviously in pain. She has a bottle of morphine, but living life. She has a bottle of Jameson in one hand, and she's somebody in love with life. She says love unconditional, keeping her this side of the threshold. And you can hear and feel and sense the admiration that the speaker, the writer, the poet feels for her aunt. And you realise this poem is a celebration. It's a celebration of a life, of this, this woman. And the next three stanzas are quite sad, and they depict Cora's struggle with illness. As her body withered and her eyes grew darker and stranger, as her hair grew back after chemo, thick and curly as when she was a girl, always a girl in her glance teasing death, humour a lance she tilted at death, scourge of the Croydon tram drivers and high street dossers on her motorised invalid scooter that last year. So she was so sick. In her last year, she was an invalid. She was on a scooter, but she was still brave and noble and awe-inspiring. How do we know that? Because of the brilliant use of imagery. Look at what she says about her aunt. She says, humour a lance she tilted at death. Isn't that fantastic? The tilt is the separation between two knights as they joust. To tilt is to compete in a competition between knights. When we think of knights, we think of tournaments, we think of nobility and bravery and, the kind of the best of us, I suppose. And when she thinks of her aunt, she thinks of bravery, and she thinks of the best of us. She thinks of Cora's determination to keep going, her stubborn will to live in the face of death, the repetition of death. Clearly, it was there, and she wasn't afraid of it. She stared it down. She laughed at it. She teased it. And the writer, the poet, is in awe of her aunt, and she celebrates her. My favourite line in the opening sequence, and this is brilliant, but when she says in the opening sequence, bearing the pain, not crucifixion, but glory in her voice. That gets me, makes me. I have a little moment where, you know, it's beautiful, and it's a kick in the ass for those of us who sometimes feel sorry for ourselves. She never got up on her cross, Cora. Sounds like she you know, would have been within her rights to. She was really sick and life was really hard on her, and she had to take morphine to. Obviously, she was in a lot of pain, but she never felt sorry for herself. She never got up on her cross. No crucifixion, but glory. She enjoyed every moment of her life. And then we get this final, just wonderful description of her. And what we get is this image of somebody who wasn't traditionally beautiful, but there's no doubt, because she was, you know, withered away, old skin, bag of bones. But there's no doubt that the poet thinks of her as beautiful. Grinning back at the rictus of death, always a girl in her name. There's death again. Always a girl in her name. Cora, maiden, from the Greek Cora, promising, blossom, summer, the scent of rhyme. And you just want to go. Those images are gorgeous. Blossom, you know, bright. Springtime, hope, beauty. Summer, warmth, optimism. The scent, the olfactory sense stimulated by that, the scent of time. And you just know that when the poet thinks of her aunt Cora, who has died, she thinks of someone that represents the best of us. So she wasn't just some Elwyn, some mad Elwyn with a bottle of Jameson in her hand, driving her invalid scooter, a beggar sitting on the streets. She was a wonderful, positive woman, worthy of celebration and worthy of commemoration. And that's what this poem does. Now, if the poem just ended there, it'd be a super poem, just brilliant imagery and, you know, just a wonderful description of a character, but it doesn't end there. And it has this wonderful second part in which the poet takes us on a time shift. We go back to when Cora was young. Sequin, she is standing on the kitchen table. She is nearly 21. It is 1961. So all the way back when Cora was only a young woman, 20 years old. So, you know, the poem describes her in her 60s. So we're talking about a 40-year gap. And she says they are sewing red sequins, the women, to the hem of her white satin dress as she moves slowly round and round. Who are these women? Sequins as red as berries, simile, red as the lips of maidens, simile, red as blood in the snow, simile, in child's old ballads, as red as this pen on this white paper I've snatched from the chaos to cast these lines on at my own kitchen table. Cora, Mary, Jacinta, my aunties, Helena, my mother, Mary, my grandmother. So it's this memory of her when she was a kid. You know, she was only small. Down here she says, I orbit the table I can barely see over. She was only a very small child. And her auntie Cora was standing up on the middle of this table, and her loved ones, her mother and her sisters, were all sewing sequins onto her dress. And it's just this fantastic image. It's brilliantly drawn. I do believe this about Paula Meehan. I teach poetry, and I'm probably not as aware of poetry as I should be. But this is a great. Paula Meehan is a great poet. She's a capacity to bring scenes and scenarios vividly to life. Her language is direct, accessible, imaginative. She's a marvelous writer. And that sequence with her standing up on the table and all these people around her, and you wonder why is she remembering? Why is this memory being put in the poem? And you read it, you realise when you read, for me, what is the best line in the poem and the best line in the Paula Meehan poems I know, which is the light of those years only reaching me now. If you're studying this poem for your Leaving Cert, learn those two lines. It's a brilliant example of symbolism and metaphor, figurative language that all mean the same thing. The light imagery with all of its, you know, allusions to hope and optimism. But no, it's that idea of the light only reaching me now. And it's that idea of, you know, we often, you know, in Filling Station by Bishop, the way she mentions the embroidered doily, that always gets me as well. I have a moment. I think I'm getting old. Because that's about love, and it's about the little things that people do for each other that show love and that often aren't noticed or never mind appreciated. And I think that image of the light of those stars only reaching me now. I mean, you think about people that you love who've passed away. You think about people who were your friends who you've drifted from. Naturally, that happens in life. You think about how good we have it often, and how we don't appreciate it until years later when we look back and go, Jesus, yeah, that was good. I think about friends of mine who I wouldn't really see anymore because time has moved on and stuff, and just the pleasure of laughing together, sitting watching a match, having a pint in the Laurels in Clondalkin, and it was just normal then. But now when I look back on it, the light of those years reaches me, and when you might think of your childhood, you might think of a grandparent, you might think of somebody you love, and at the time you just took it for granted. But now you look back, the light of those years reaching me now. It's a brilliant piece of writing about what connects us, memories, the beauty we have in our life. Just these women sitting around, helping their sister, showing love, sewing the sequins onto her dress just so she can look pretty. She was a week from taking the boat to England. Dust on the mantelpiece, dust on the card she left behind. A black cat swinging in a silver horseshoe, a giant key to the door, emblems of luck and access. Sorry, she was about to emigrate to Croydon in London, where we see her at the beginning of the poem, 40 years after this, broken in an invalid scooter and in pain. And this is this really kind of moving moment where they were all they wanted her to look pretty. She was obviously going out to some sort of function before she emigrated, before she left them. And they had no money, they were poor. But what they could do was show love and togetherness and support by sewing the sequins onto her dress. And then the last sequence of the poem is about things which have value and don't appear to have value. She again draws this beautiful little scenario of her as a child hunting the sequins around the house. The sequins, they come in big packs, and it can be, if you open the pack, they can spill everywhere. So all that year I hunted sequins, roaming the house. I found them in cracks and crannies, in the pillowcase under the stairs, in a hole in the lino. Lino was linoleum, it's like a floor covering. In a split in the sofa, in a tear in the armchair, in the home of a shy mouse. They were clearly not wealthy. The furniture is ragged and broken, and there's vermin there, so they weren't wealthy when she was a child. With odd beads and single earrings, a broken charm bracelet, a glittering pin, I gathered them into a tin box. So we have this image of a child gathering things which are essentially worthless, but keeping them because to the child they were of great value. They were shiny and sparkly, and they were her little treasures when she was poor and small. So this image of gathering together things that appear to be of no value to other people, but are of great value to you. And clearly it's a wonderful metaphor. She says, which I now open now in memory, the coinage, the sudden glamour of an emigrant soul. I love the ending. And I'll just read this. It evokes images of things that appear to be of little value, but are precious. Cora, who was she? Nobody to anybody but her family. But now, when we read this, to me, she's an inspiration. She's a human being. She's alive. One of the things that Yeats talks about is the idea of we die, or we've just forgotten. Is that it? In Silent Byzantium, he thinks about those ideas. If you're lucky enough to have someone like Paula Meehan in your life, and she writes a poem which celebrates you, she gives you immortality, because as long as people can read, and as long as this poem exists, something of Cora also exists. So it's a brilliant poem. To an outsider, Cora was of little importance, a girl who grew into an old woman who died of cancer. But the memory of her shines brightly and is precious to the poet, just as the shining sequences were precious to that child in 1961. It's a great poem. It's a celebration of a person. It ties very well with My Father as a Vision of St. Francis. It ties very well with Hearth Lesson. It ties very well with Death of a Field, Prayer for the Children of Longing. Hope you found that in some way useful. If you did, give it one of those, will you? Cheers, guys.